afternoon. My name is Becky Tuden. I'm the Ecological Services Manager for the East Bay Regional Park District. And I'm here to talk about the East Bay Ecological Health Assessment that we have been working on with our partner agencies for a little over 2 years. What is an ecological health assessment? In a sentence, it is using the most current, as in existing data, and your best professional judgment to understand and evaluate the ecological health of the East Bay. So why is that important? And how is that different from what we currently do? Well, as you know, we gather a lot of data. We do monitoring either for research, for permit compliance, or easement conditions. But those tend to be very site-specific or project-specific, and they're often looking at limited or specific species, most notably state or federally listed species. And what we want is a broader evaluation that pulls that all together. And that's looking at it on the landscape scale. It means going across jurisdictional boundaries. And we were also looking for something that was science-based but had an ecosystem perspective. And by looking at it more broadly, you can be more collaborative. You can pull the resources and the data sets from multiple entities and inventories. And it also allows you, that collaboration and larger study area allows you to leverage more grant funding. And then it also lets you collaborate in the future on land management, whether it's for managing invasive species that definitely don't pay attention to borders, or looking at habitat corridors and movements that you want to look at a bigger scale. And the type of assessment we're talking about is similar to other efforts that are going on around the country and the state. Most notably is the One TAM Peak Health Assessment. The National Park Service also has an analysis that's similar to this called the Natural Resource Condition Assessment. Save the Redwood League. So there's even a statewide effort that's looking at landscapes across the entire state. So while we relied very heavily on these previous efforts, I want to point out that our approach here in the East Bay will be different because we're tailoring it to the data that we have and the suite of species that we have. So there's no right answer for how to do this. We're just seeking a better answer for how to explain our ecology. And so those ecological health outcomes where we're looking for monitoring the health and viability of our ecosystems, and also coordinating with other agencies to inventory, evaluate, and manage our natural resources, that's in line with our master plan goals. So not only is it a good idea, but it's a good idea that our board and Park District are in support. So I keep saying we, and I want to say that I am presenting this ecological health assessment, but that we've been working with 4 other partner agencies in the East Bay. The East Bay Municipal Utility District, the Contra Costa Water District, the San Francisco Public Utility Commission, and California State Parks. And together we are forming the East Bay Stewardship Network. And as I mentioned, we've been working on this since 2018. Together, our acreage is close to 200,000 acres of land that we manage or oversee. So let me talk to you about what our area of focus is. Here's the map of what we're calling our East Bay area of focus for the health assessment. And you'll see those brightly colored yellow, green, red, purple. Those are the actual properties of our partner agencies. As I mentioned, it's close to 200,000 acres. Now, not all properties are included. Our lands are not contiguous. So we ranked all of our land holdings looking at whether they met a certain size threshold, what was the amount of undeveloped area, are they adjacent to another partner agency? And then we came up with these properties. I want to point out also that we did not include urbanized areas in our area of focus. And we also did not include the coastal zone, even though the Park District does own a lot of land and marsh and natural habitat along the estuary. There are just a number of other assessment and monitoring efforts going on in the coastal zone. There's the tidal wetland monitoring framework. There's the integrated regional wetlands monitoring program. And rather than layer another assessment on top of that, we decided to not include the coastal zone in this assessment. And then we also relied heavily on the Conservation Lands Network units. That's a Bay Area-wide effort that is collecting a lot of data on habitat and corridors and linkages. And we tried to line up our borders to match those so that we could rely on the existing data that they have, and also that it was a common vernacular. So then took those subregions that are in the Conservation Lands Network and broke them into 3 subregions for our health assessment. And we have the East Bay Hills subregion, the Mount Diablo subregion, and the Mount Hamilton subregion. So what was interesting is when we sat down with our partners around the table and we're discussing, embarking on this ecological health assessment, the question came up, how big an area do we want? Let's start with one watershed. And the more we looked at it, the bigger the area got, until we basically said, let's look at the whole East Bay. But we recognized that there were some differences, and that we might want to look at differences in those subregions for management purposes or for data assessment purposes. So we, in addition to looking at the bigger entire East Bay, we will be able to look at indicators and species on the subregion. So I discussed our project goals, I discussed our partners, and I discussed our area of focus. The next step is the framework. So we're looking to develop a science-driven ecological baseline that we can see and measure changes in the East Bay's ecological health. And the first thing we did was identify indicator species and community types. The next step is you pick metrics for those, and I'll walk through and explain these. Then peer review of those metrics, analyze the existing data that you have with those metrics, and then you determine the ecological health and trend. So what is an indicator? What do we mean by that? Sometimes it's called a focal resource. Essentially, you cannot measure every aspect of ecology, and we wanted to capture the aspects that we think are important or reflective or representative of the overall ecological health and measure those. For an analogy, a canary is an indicator, right? It's measuring the amount of breathable air in a coal mine. That's giving you an indication of the health of that area. So some other questions that you look for in an indicator: or is it present in the study area? And you want to know how much information you have or how much expert opinion is on that indicator. And again, is it useful? Is it telling you something about that East Bay ecology, about biodiversity or habitat quality, or even indirectly? Is it, if you look at birds, are they giving you an indication of cavities in that mature forest? And then also you want to consider an iconic or charismatic species, because that can be used to build public interest and understanding. And then an indicator can be either an individual species, or it can be a taxonomic group or a vegetation community, or you can even roll all of those up. For example, take every single species that's in a grassland and look at that as a community assemblage. So we picked, for the East Bay Ecological Health Assessment, we picked the golden eagle, which is, we felt, an iconic bird that we had a lot of data on. And we're looking at mammals, both keystone species like the California ground squirrel, but also mesa carnivores, bats, and the mountain lion. We're looking at salmonids, reptiles and amphibians, including the western pond turtle, the California red-legged frog, and the California tiger salamander. So again, we're looking at species that have different habitat types, different trophic levels, aquatic and non-aquatic, and how those species, it will give you information about the ecology at different scales. And as I mentioned, some are keystone species like the ground squirrel, some might be a more indirect indicator. And then we also looked at vegetation communities. We looked at oak woodlands and grasslands, as well as aquatic systems and wetlands. And some of those indicators had much more information than others. For birds, we have a lot of information through eBird data. For fish, we have decades of stream surveys. We also have a lot of data on listed species. But even if we have all that data, it can be hard to collate it across jurisdictions with different timing, different levels of analysis on that. And then there are some of these indicators that we don't have a lot of data on, like oak woodlands and grasslands, that we haven't been monitoring the same metric over a long period of time. And finally, there are some indicators that we would like to include, but we have not gotten to, including the chaparral scrub and the redwood forest or coniferous forests. And then we also acknowledge that there are some important indicators through invertebrates, but that we don't have much data on those at all, and that it's a huge data gap. So we selected those indicators, and then the goal was to measure them. That's what we use the metrics for, is they measure the condition of that indicator. Note that different taxa and indicators have a different amount of information and data available for that. So this coming up with metrics and thresholds is the most challenging part of an ecological health assessment. There's tough calls that you have to make about coming up with these bright lines when you go from one condition to another. You don't often have perfect data. We live in an imperfect world, and it can be a tough call. So I just want to tell you that it is the nitty-gritty, and we did hold a peer review workshop in January, a 2-day workshop where we had scientists and biologists who were experts in the fields of those indicators come and work with us and review those metrics. So just to explain a little bit more what a metric is, and I'm going to use an example first of something we're more familiar with, which is the human body. One indicator of human health might be your circulatory system. That would be an indicator of your whole overall health. And a metric for measuring your circulatory system could be your blood pressure, or it could be your heart rate, or it could be the oxygen levels in your bloodstream. Each of those might be a metric. And then you would have a threshold for each of those metrics. For example, for your heart rate, a threshold would be 60 to 80 beats per minute, and that would be likely a healthy condition. If you get 80 to 100, that's probably caution, and if you're over 100 beats per minute, or let's say under 30, then that's a serious concern. So that's an example of a metric, your blood beats per minute, that's going in and out of different thresholds. So what I have in front of us is the California red-legged frog is the indicator, and we often have multiple metrics for one indicator. In this case, we have, is it widely present? Is it well dispersed? And is it free of invasive species? And then the thresholds vary with each metric. For example, for well dispersed, you're looking at the number and size of the metapopulations of California red-legged frog, and you're going to say it's good if you're maintaining or increasing those metapopulations, caution if they're declining, and then significant concern if they decline by 20%. And again, this is probably more technical, but I'm telling you because it's the stewardship seminar, and I think you can take it, but feel free to ask questions on this later. And so then here's the overall framework that once you put your indicator through the metrics and the thresholds, you come up with the condition. That's the current state. And we have good, caution, or significant concern. And then there's the trend. How is that data, what is it looking like looking forward? Is it improving? Is it stable, or is it declining? And then probably most importantly is the confidence level, is how robust the data are and how confident are you. If you have a lot of information over a number of years and you feel, on each of the different metrics, you would say we have high confidence. But if you only have really good information on one metric and the other metrics you're just relying on research, you might say moderate. And if you're really just relying on best professional judgment without a lot of specific long-term data, you would say low or even no confidence. And so we use that as a way to communicate to the public how each indicator is doing. And if you look at the bottom example, let's just say, we could say the California red-legged frog was in caution. It's doing okay, but it's not great. And we might say the trend is stable, and looking over the last 10 years of data, it's been pretty stable, and we're not worried about it going precipitously dropping. But we might say we don't have a lot of confidence because we only have a few data sets for a few ponds, which is not true, but that's an example. So that is the framework for the ecological health assessment and our metrics. So as I mentioned, we've been working on this since May 2018 with our partner agencies. And we worked very hard to develop the indicator species and the community types we wanted to evaluate. And we developed metrics for those. And then in January of 2020, we conducted that 2-day workshop where we did a peer review of that. And that was really a high point in working on this because there was a lot of synergy and excitement about the project. And, you know, people were coming up, the scientists and experts were coming up with a lot of good suggestions that we can then retool. And then, as we all know, COVID hit. So the next steps in the ecological health assessment, which are to analyze the data using those revised metrics, and then determining the health and trend, the actual final report, we put on hold. But here we are today, and again, we're moving forward with looking at developing an ecological health assessment that will give us a landscape level quantitative baseline that we can use as a benchmark for evaluating future changes. And this would be a science-driven baseline that we can see and measure that change over time. It's also going to give us information on our key data gaps that we recognize we don't have existing data on, and that we would want to gather more data to improve our understanding. And then also to use that information to better manage our landscape, to help inform our management actions and resource decisions. For example, are we finding that the CTS, California tiger salamander community, is declining? And are we in fact managing our ponds more for the hydro period and the turbidity that you get with red-legged frogs rather than CTS? That would be an example of how we could change our management actions. So as I mentioned, we kind of took a break, as we all did when COVID hit, and we're starting to retool and move forward on this that are going to require a lot more resources and a concerted effort for the data synthesis and assessment, pooling together our information on data gaps and identifying future research, as well as writing up the final report, and then communicating to the public, and then implementing whatever adaptive management. But the good news is that the Park District's, the Stewardship Department has identified this as a priority project, and we really do want to move forward and complete this ecological health assessment. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm available for questions if you are at all curious about something that I didn't get to. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks, Becky. So the first question is, why were coastal areas excluded?
So there were a number of reasons that coastal areas were excluded. One of them was because the East Bay Park District was the only agency that had land along the coastal zone. So when we did the ranking, they fell out of the, they dropped to the bottom for a number of reasons. And then also, I think I mentioned there's a lot of other San Francisco Bay-wide efforts looking at the health of the wetlands and of the shoreline of the coastal zone. And we just didn't want to lay another analysis on top of what was already a big effort going on.
Yeah, we have, the subtitle goals report for the Bay, and there's other, adaptation, SFEI just did a recent study identifying some restoration and adaptation needs and opportunities that does also establish some habitat goals for certain areas. So I think that's what we're kind of looking to build on. So
and we certainly understand that coastal species are important and they have an interaction with the upland species. It's just we're doing what we can one chunk at a time, and it just made sense to keep that part separate for now.
So the next one says, excellent presentation, Becky. You have my deepest gratitude for your leadership and tenacity in pursuing this very important endeavor, which in many ways is forward-looking to the Park District's success in thriving in a new natural world that is adapting to climate change, to a changing climate. Bravo. Deputy General Manager, Dr. Ana Alvarez.
Thank you. And we could not have done this without the partnership of East Bay Mud, Bert Mulcahy, and Jessica Purificato, as well as the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, Jessica Appel and Neil Fujita, Contra Costa Water District, and State Park. So really, I think what makes this effort unique is that we have all these other landowners and partner agencies that are interested in pooling their data with us.
Yeah, and then another question is, realizing this is relatively new, can any preliminary conclusions be made as to the effect of climate change and impacts from accelerated climate change?
Climate change was listed as a stressor in almost every case. And I think it depends upon our data sets and how far back they go. I mean, I think what was probably more pertinent was Win-Moss's presentation yesterday on how the amphibians responded during the climate change. And you can see that, there was definitely a change over time. I think we'll probably see more moving forward when we have our baseline. And then we can see how that's changing, when we do the next iteration.
Yeah, and I think that's also a fundamental reason why we wanted to do this assessment and come up with some common monitoring parameters and then agree on these stressors. So as we do future research, we're able to evaluate how that's changing. So that was really a primary driver in this ecological health assessment, the need to have common understanding and language between our agencies and to inform that future monitoring. So we hope that this effort and this continued effort will help get us better information in that area. So the next one, this is a great project. Are you able to address impacts to special status species like burrowing owls?
Sorry, there's construction going on outside, so I couldn't hear that. Can you?
Okay, yeah, are you able to address impacts to special status species like burrowing owls?
So the burrowing owl, we had a long discussion about whether or not to include burrowing owls as one of our indicators. And I know we all heard the talk yesterday on burrowing owls and how we're seeing a decline. Because the coastal zone is important for a lot of their life cycle, we did not include burrowing owls. They're also not present throughout the entire study area. We may revisit that. But we did have a number of listed species in our health assessment, most notably the red-legged frog and the California tiger salamandre.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Okay. Well, it appears to be our last question. So thank you, Becky, and guess we'll move on to do my closing presentations.